So box.
Hi, my name is Rochelle, and you're listening or watching Box F1 Pod. Today we're going to be discussing the Singapore Grand Prix, which was insane, by the way. And while I'm going to be making a fish head curry, which is a national or traditional dish in Singapore. And as you can see over here, I have all my stuff ready. I have already steamed the fish head. Can you see it? Okay. And so I'm going to be starting to prep everything as I get going. But before we get into the weekend and everything that happened and Carlos Sainz, first up is the digital warm-up. Lap 1, F1 news. Okay, so first up, big news is that no one breached the cost cap in 2022. I think everyone's mostly excited to see what the audit is for 2023, since that is when Red Bull was dominating. So I think that's where everyone is most suspicious. Not me. I'm never suspicious. But I think that's what people want to see, but we're obviously not going to see that until next year. Also, Zhou Guanyu has been re-signed to Alfa Romeo or Sauber or whatever they're going to be called next year, which is very exciting. I think it's only a 1-year contract. But I am mostly excited about it because that means that he will finally get to compete in his home race, assuming that China will actually happen next year. It's supposed to happen this year, didn't happen. So we'll see if it happens next year. But I'm happy to have Guanyu remain and his fit. He's incredible. Another thing that's been rumored, Nico obviously has re-signed with Haas, but it was rumored that Sauber really wanted him for their lineup and he really wanted to go to Sauber, but apparently Luther Steiner blocked it. Don't know how much merit there is to that rumor. I think it was accredited to a respected F1 journalist, whatever that means. But that is a rumor. So far, that's all that we have in terms of driver shakeups that we don't already know. I think most of the grid is sort of finalized. We're still waiting on like Yuki, the AlphaTauri seat, both AlphaTauri seats, I guess. Lance's seat, TBD. But mostly I think we're pretty covered for next year. Another big thing that happened is that Dr. Helmut Marko made a statement about Checo in the news. It was part of a longer statement, but one of the things he said is that we know that he has problems in qualifying, he has fluctuations in form. Marko told Red Bull owns Service TV after the Italian Grand Prix. He is South American, and he is just not as completely focused in his head as Max or Sebastian. First of all, Mexico's in North America. Second of all, what? He did issue an apology, or an apology was issued on his behalf. Not even sure if he knows it went out. But the apology read, I would like to apologize for my offensive remark and want to make it absolutely clear that I do not believe that we can generalize about the people from any country, any race, any ethnicity. I was trying to make a point that Checo has fluctuated in his performance this year, but it was wrong to attribute this to his cultural heritage. Also the wrong cultural heritage because he's not South American. But whatever. The response, there was major backlash from this. Everyone was like, he's racist, he's horrible, why is he not being held accountable, why has he not been fired? Everyone was being asked about it. Everyone, what do you think, what do you think, what do you think? Obviously this apology was issued from the official Red Bull company, because that's who he works for. He doesn't actually work for Red Bull Racing. And the FIA also gave him a written warning against, I don't know, saying dumb stuff. But Checo's comment in particular about it was, I had a private conversation with him. He did apologize, and that to me was the main thing. Yeah, basically we move on. I have a personal relationship with him, and I think you always have that. You can always have those feelings when you see that sort of stuff. Knowing the person helps a lot because I know he doesn't mean it in that way. I took his apology because I know Helmut from the personal relationship that we have, that he doesn't mean it in that way. and I didn't get offended at all personally. Let's say if those comments were on a different perspective or so on, I would have taken them differently. To me, it's just how things are, and I don't get them personal. However, obviously these comments, when you read them in isolation, can be very disrespectful. But like I say, knowing Helmut, having that personal relationship for me, helped me a lot to understand him, and like I say, he gave me a personal apology. So like everything, when you have a personal relationship, it's a lot more important, the personal feeling than the public feeling. I assume that Checo doesn't really have the freedom to say what he actually thinks, but I do kind of believe that he wasn't actually offended by this because it was such an absurd statement. It's hard to really be offended by it. Also, what is offensive is that he's 80, travels the world for a living, and doesn't know that Mexico is not in South America. Anyway, another thing that happened last week was that Toto said that no one cares about Max's 10 race in a row statistic, that is just for Wikipedia and doesn't actually matter. And Max's response to this was, they had a pretty shit race at Monza, so probably he was still pissed off with their performance. He almost sounds like he's an employee of our team sometimes, you know? But luckily not. Which is somehow simultaneously a dig at his own team for always being super petty and sassy in the media, but also a dig at Toto because he doesn't want him on his team. And it was just a very well-layered sass in one statement, you know? Okay, lap 2, off-duty F1. Alex went on a YouTube channel called Korean Englishman, where he ate Korean barbecue, and it was an incredible episode. You should watch it if you have not. There are a lot of nuggets about how much Alex loves food and about travel and about F1. But my favorite bit was when he started telling the people on the show about this guy named Yuki, who's an F1 driver, and his dream in life is not to win a world championship, but it's actually to own a restaurant. And then he paused for dramatic effect. And one of the guys on the show goes, "Well, that's a much more realistic goal," which made me laugh. But I just love that Alex talks about Yuki in the same way that we all talk about Yuki. That's how I describe Yuki to my friends, with giddiness, and I just love Yuki, and I'm so glad that the drivers love Yuki too. Alright, speaking of guest starring on random YouTube shows, which I'm sure they're actually not random, I just personally haven't watched them before, but Pierre and Charles were on a French one called Guess the Imposter, and there are so many of these clips have been on my For You page. They're all, one is better than the next, but one of my favorite ones that I really wanted to mention was, it's basically where they participate in random scenarios, and you have to guess if the other person is lying or not. One of them is the imposter, and you spend the whole time trying to figure out who it is, but you spend the whole time trying to figure out if one person is lying or not. And so Charles was in a scenario where he's talking to a therapist, and she starts asking him about any dreams or nightmares he might have had, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I had this one nightmare, and when I woke up from it, I shouted one word." And she was like, "What was the word?" And he was like, "Box." And Pierre, who's also there, just breaks down laughing on the floor. It was so funny. I just love that they're always joking. There was another part in the episode where Pierre makes a joke about Charles having bad strategy or whatever, and Charles is like, "You stop with your jokes about me and my strategy," which just makes me laugh that they joke about it all the time, that Charles is at the point where his pain is his laughter, and I just love that. The Girl the Grid for the year has finally ended, and Carlos actually won the whole year. But in the latest episode, the last episode that I saw, I don't know if it was actually the last one, but the last one I saw was the geography one. And it's just, every time it's so comical how many of them know so little about the geography. But my favorite was Max, who was asked they were supposed to describe each place they were putting on, and Max was like, "I'll explain later," and just put up the whole map and then went through every single one and gave a very detailed explanation. And at the end he was like, "Obviously I know where I race." And the lady was like, "You'd be surprised how many don't," which is true. Charles, better than Lando was bad. Also, Yuki went to the Venice Film Festival to promote the new documentary for AlphaTauri that I guess premiered at the festival. And he arrived in full-on black suit on a boat at the front of the boat with the AlphaTauri car on it. Looked great. So also, George and Carmen, his girlfriend, went to the rugby finals, and they looked so good. I think they're the only F1 couple that are consistently shared. Not the only F1 couple, he's the only F1 driver who's consistently shared in other sports social media pages. He was at Wimbledon. He was sharing the Wimbledon page. There was another one, another rugby finals. And it's definitely specifically because Carmen puts together the most like immaculate outfits possible. They look amazing. Yeah. Speaking of George, when they got to Singapore, he said that they reached out to the local courts and asked to reserve them after hours. And the first night it was him and Lando, and they posted the pictures from that. It was very cute. And he said the next day they weren't allowed to reserve the courts because a bunch of people wanted that. And when they got there, it was like half the F1 grid. They saw Lance playing with someone. They saw Antonio and Pierre playing together, Antonio Giovinazzi. And then they also, there was videos of like Kevin Magnussen there as well. And it looked like they were all playing together, but I think there was just several games at once, and the angle made it look like they were all playing with each other. But also just like a very weird group. And now I think I'm putting it together that they weren't actually a group. They were just all on individual courts. Just the courts are small, so it looks like they're all together. All right, lap 3, trackside in Singapore. So Daniel Ricciardo is back. He, first of all, before he came back, he posted an update of his hand. And it shows him working out, so he's clearly trying to stay in shape. And but the first picture in that collection was of his scar. It's a gnarly scar. Whatever happened to him was aggressive, and I really want the details. Like, I need a medical professional to side by side compare the injury that Lance had and the injury that Daniel had, and explain why one was allowed to race and one was not, because I don't get it. But I'm glad he's taking this time. However, he did make his return. He was in Singapore. He came with Scotty James, aka Lance's brother-in-law. Okay, I'm going to add the garlic to the onion now. So he joined Scotty James, and they both are partners or sponsors or representatives, whatever the word is, of OKX, which I think is cryptocurrency or gambling or something. So they were both, I think, in Singapore to promote, because I saw them doing some promotional shoots for OKX. But I just love anytime they're together. They post the greatest content. I think they did a track run together, and Daniel was seen at the track. I think he was there on Friday. I don't remember seeing him there at the race or during qualifying, but he did make a trackside appearance, and I don't know if they're trying to keep him on the schedule in case he can race in Japan, so that he's ready to go and doesn't have to like acclimate or whatever. But because Liam also said that he has no idea if he is going to be racing in Japan, he just is taking it race by race. So TBD on that, but I'm assuming they want Daniel at every race from now on in case he's ready to go. All right, in other news, Esty Bestie turned 27. He posted a great picture of his cake from Alpine, which looked very homemade, and just had like the candles spell out happy birthday instead of icing, which I kind of love. Like, keep the cake tasting. The icing doesn't taste that good. Like, I love that the cake was like very homey and cute. And there's also a picture posted of Mick giving him a little birthday hug. Okay, now I'm gonna add all the spices and the curry and tamarind. Okay, so now that I've added the water, it has to come to a boil, and then I will add the rest of it. In the meantime, back to Esteban. He had a great moment during one of the fan events on stage, where it was him, Pierre, and I think Charles and Carlos. And Esteban was asked if he could only bring one other driver to a desert island. Who would it be? And he's not allowed to pick his teammate. And automatically Esteban goes, "Oh, I wasn't going to bring him anyways." And everyone starts laughing, but the person laughing the hardest is Pierre, because he knows that's true. We all know that's true, but Pierre's like, "I wouldn't bring you either." So a hilarious moment during the Williams fan event was one of the fans asked Logan if he had learned the conversion rate from a kilometer yet. Logan said he had, but I feel like every American can relate that at some point some conversion stumped you. So poor Logan's gonna have to live that down forever. Although he has lived in Europe forever, so I don't know why he doesn't know. Also, Alex launched a new pair of shoes. They're like sneakers that are kind of fuzzy, which I guess is an homage to his pets. He did a whole marketing video with his actual pets where he had like a marketing meeting and they all participated to come up with ideas and they came up with the shoes. And on Sunday, he posted a picture of him and Lily entering the track wearing them. And he's like, "My marketing budget's running low." But honestly, who better to promote his shoes than Lily? Honestly, the best model you could possibly ask for. Or so I thought, until I saw at the driver's parade, Fernando came up and just like came up. There's a picture of him next to Alex Albon's car with his like foot up on the door, showing off that he's wearing his shoes. And the caption from Williams was, "Damn, Fernando, back at it again with the fresh Albonos," which is a throwback to "Damn, Daniel." If anyone remembers that. Also, just saw, like literally right before, I saw a picture of Yuki wearing them as well. He was showing them off at a press conference to all the boys, and it was very cute. Speaking of that fan event though, Alex was asked about him and George carpooling back to Monaco together, and he said it was the worst experience of his life because George was actually a terrible driver. Apparently, he drives very fast. He drives a road car like it's an F1 car, and Alex was very scared for his life the entire time. He also said it was his car, but he was too scared to try and switch seats with George because George was insisting on driving all the way back. It's very amusing. All right, lap 4, ranking ice bath content. So there is no Singapore Grand Prix without an ice bath, and I think there's some very important criteria for an ice bath that makes it above and beyond. 1, they exist. Some teams don't do the ice bath content, and that's a tragedy. We also get a good shot of the face. We need to see the face because it depicts a lot of emotions, particularly when you're in a bath of ice. 3, I'm a big fan of decor. I think the ducks are essential, and the wackier the ducks, the better. Or the more ducks, the better. And also any sort of personality when there's a whole video involved. I love to see how the drivers handle that sort of situation. So I think those 4 things make a really excellent piece of ice bath content. Some of my favorites from this year were Ferrari's always number 1 because they really understand the value of ice bath content. They had a picture of Charles, and anything with Charles' face in it is automatically good. So that wins automatically. And Carlos had the ducks, and he also had a customized duck that a fan made him from Hungary, and it had like sideburns, and it was great. And so they win just because of the sideburn duck and their faces. I also really liked Alpine. They only posted Pierre, but Pierre didn't have ducks, but he did have a giant chunk of ice that he was like bench pressing in the tub. So that gets extra points because that's fun. And then I also want to shout out Lando and Oscar. Oscar had a great rubber duck photo shoot, and I really appreciated the quantity that were in there. And also he and Lando did theirs together, and the picture shows that, and I really like the team camaraderie. And they just both look like little kids taking a bath because they're so small. And I love that. So 10 out of 10. And the ones that didn't post any ice bath content, shame on you. Shame. Okay. If you think that other teams did a better job than I happen to miss any, I know Mercedes also did one, but I wasn't as excited about theirs. But they also had one. So A plus for even having it. But if you think I missed any, give me a shout. And with that, we conclude our digital warm-up. We conclude our digital warm-up. On to the race run. The Singapore GP had nightlight, sweat, and ice baths aplenty. Will this be another clean sweep for Red Bull, or will they come up empty? Well, after Lance had a horrible crash, glad he's okay by the way, Liam Lawson knocks Max out in Q2. Slay Liam, slay. Carlos, Georgie, and Charles are our top three. George had big plans for Sunday, but Carlos is like, bitch please. When the lights went out and away they all went, a puncture ruins Yuki's race in lap 1 and crushes any point dreams he might have dreamt. Carlos, however, maintains the lead, and right behind him is his faithful prancing steed. The Ferraris lead up until the first safety car, then a double stack keeps Carlos on track but sends Charles back way far. Now Carlos's big brain energy takes control. He has made himself CEO of the race's pace control. It's a masterclass in creating and executing strategy, but then a virtual safety car changes this race's anatomy. With just 15 laps to go, both Mercedes pit for fresh tires. Now they're nipping at Lando's heels and all his podium desires. Carlos and his big brain energy were like, Lando will get a podium, you'll see. Cause he my best friend, he a real bad bitch, got his own pace, but need a slipstream real quick. Lando and Carlos telepathically join forces against enemy number 1 and leave Merc in the dust and score Carlos his second P1. Sadly, Georgie lands in the wall. The excitement was too much, I guess. Don't fret, Georgie, you'll get them next time, no sweat. Carlos got that real big brain energy, and when you ignore Ferrari, life becomes a fantasy. Next up is the Japanese GP, which means Katsu, Karaoke, and Yuki. Okay, on to analysis. So before I get started with analysis, the stuff is boiled, so I am going to add how cute our neighbor gave us little peppers from his yard. So I put those in. Now I've added tomatoes, and now it has to simmer for just a bit before I add the eggplant and then the coconut cream and then the fish. Okay, so on to analysis. So before we get into quali, I wanted to give a few updates on the track. First of all, it has been updated. There are 3 turns that used to exist. They used to go like under the stands, have now been replaced with 1 long straight, which the drivers seem very excited about. The racing was very good this year, so I guess if that's part of the reason, we should keep it. But I don't remember what was bad about it before, but they say it's great, so I believe them. Also, just to keep in mind as we talk about this race, both quali and race day were over like around 86 degrees and around 74% humidity at night. It's insane. I actually didn't see any stats about how much weight was lost during the race, but I can imagine it was hefty. All right, so quali was kind of insane. In Q1, Lance obviously had a horrible crash, like actually horrible, like half the car was missing. Like on one side, all you could see was the cockpit. It was insane. He was fine, or he seemed fine. He went to the medical center. Then they forced him to go to the media pen to do interviews. But then this morning, before the race, they announced that he was actually under doctor's orders, not supposed to race. I don't know if something happened after, or they just kept it under wraps to see if it got better or worse. But apparently, doctor said he should not be racing. But part of me also thinks that maybe they also couldn't repair the car in time, because it was like significant damage, but they usually can do that, so I'm not entirely sure that that's the reason. Maybe he actually is very sick. They just didn't go into very much detail, which they usually do not with Lance's varying ailments. And also, for those wondering why, what's his name? Filipe Drugovich didn't replace him, it is because the rules say that you can only race on Sunday if you competed in qualifying. Which means if you're going to crash your car and need someone to replace you, it should happen during free practice, not during qualifying. So Aston Martin ended up running only 1 car on Sunday. The other big thing that happened was basically that Red Bull sucked. Like they were like deer on ice. They had no like traction. Nothing seemed to work. Max just kept getting angrier and angrier. And most shockingly was that both Red Bulls were out in Q2. And Max exited Q2 because of Liam Lawson. Liam knocked him out of Q2. He was like at risk, you know, the 10th person is at risk, or 11th person at risk, 10th person, Liam knocked him out. What a little superhero, like such a moment for baby Liam Lawson. Speaking of though, I know I mention this every week, how his name sounds like the alter ego of a superhero, or like the normie name of a superhero, like Peter Parker. So what do you think Liam's superpower would be? And what would be his superhero name? I don't know. Still getting to know him. Also, what happened was that Carlos ended up getting pole position, which was very exciting. And for a moment, Charles was in P2, then George knocked him out. But I love that in that moment, waiting for George to set his time, the commentators went, "Don't discount the hustle from Russell." And they were right. They shouldn't have discounted it because he ended up getting P2. So it was P1 Carlos, P2 George, P3 Charles, and it was very exciting. My favorite moment from qualifying was actually the post qualifying press conference when one of the journalists prefaced his question with, since Liam Lawson is the only Red Bull driver to make it into the top 10, and then there was a zoom in into their faces, and Charles just like blinks forward and then turns to the side and blinks at the other two, and George turns back at him and just like raises his eyebrows and goes and then Charles has to look back forward because he's trying really hard not to laugh. Sorry, honey. Alright, so with that, the starting grid is as follows: Carlos, George, Charles, Lando, Lewis, Kevin, Fernando Alonso, Esteban, Nico, Liam, Max, Pierre, Checo, Alex, Yuki, Valtteri, Oscar, Logan, Joe, and Lance. Lance obviously had to forfeit his position and he will not be participating. Joe, however, had some changes made in Park Firm, so he will start from the pit lane on race day. Another thing that was major during qualifying was that there were so many penalty or things under investigation that the stews had to come back later to decide what to do about it. 3 of which were directed at Max Verstappen. One was where he apparently impeded from the pit lane, but I'm not sure that one actually counted because he just like had to find a gap to exit. So he was just like waiting. The third one, I don't remember which one it was, but the second one was him impeding Yuki on track, and that was a very visible impeding. But apparently the rep for AlphaTauri didn't even show up to the stew meeting about it, so he never got penalized for it. Which everyone was like, could you just try to hide it a little better? Like at least pretend like Red Bull isn't telling you exactly what to do. But yeah, so a lot of people were very shocked that Max somehow escaped with absolutely no penalties at all. But my favorite tweet about the situation was someone saying that all of Max's penalties were actually applied to Esteban instead. The FIA really, like, people say that the FIA preface Red Bull. I think they just hate Alpine. I don't know if they prefer anyone. All right, so on to the race. I'm going to do the analysis a little bit differently than usual because this race had bizarrely very distinct periods of like very thrilling edge of your seats racing and then like really boring periods of time. And also most of the excitement today was focused on the top 5, which I want to spend most of my time talking about. But first I'm going to go through the DNFs and also the like structure of the race based on incidents to set the stage before we move on. So first, the DNFs. We weirdly had a lot of DNFs this race, which like is not reflective in the number of flags and safety cars that we ended up having. First in lap 1, Yuki DNFs. Literally lap 1, there was like a quick yellow flag, and then it showed that his car somehow ended up behind the barrier, so I guess he was able to move it without like needing to stop the entire race. But I just feel really bad for Yuki because last week he didn't make it past the formation lap. This week he didn't even make it past lap 1. Just like really bad luck for poor Yuki, and I really hope it turns around because I don't want him losing his seat to Liam, which at this rate seems likely. We also lost Esteban in lap 42 due to a power failure. He was so sad. His radio just was him screaming, no, no, no. And I was very heartbroken, but also not that surprised because it is his birthday. And the birthday curse is powerful. I swear, no one succeeds on their birthday except for Carlos last week. Also, Bottas DNF due to a hydraulics issue, like 10 laps after Esteban, which was like lap 52, 53 or something like that. And then, of course, we lost George in lap 61 of 62 with like the finish line in sight. It was very sad. So the structure of the race, I'm just going to break it down so that when I reference it later, it makes sense. There was the start, then there was a safety car which was deployed around lap 22 for Logan Sargent, who somehow lost his front wing and got it trapped underneath his own wheels. And he was like scraping along to the pit lane, and like his floor must have been completely destroyed, but somehow he made it, and they removed the wing and put a new wing on. But there was so much like random debris all over the track that they ended up just having to do a safety car just to clean it all up, and it was unclear where the debris fell. It seemed like a very chill issue to stop, especially as he kept going. But because he drove around so long with so much damage, I feel like they needed to just do a clean sweep. Then there's the safety car restart. It lasted around 2 laps before the race going live. Then there was the middle of the race, which was probably the biggest lull of the day. Not much happened during this time. Then there was a virtual safety car, which was issued because of Esteban's DNF. But this was very key to Mercedes' strategy change-up, so keep that in mind. And then there was the rest of the race, which was like 15 laps. And the last few were definitely the most exciting of the whole race. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I wanted to do a few moments on Red Bull. Red Bull's race was literally like nothing to write home about. Fate was like not on their side today. After the first safety car, there was a moment when they were like right up front because they decided that they didn't want to pit during the safety car and try to make the most of like an on-track advantage. But they were on much worse tires than everyone else, and their car was just much worse than everyone else. So like it just didn't do anything for them. Max got overtaken more in like 5 laps than he has this entire year. Like it was sad. And if they did pit at that moment, the field was so closely bunched together that they would have ended up last. So like they were sort of like damned if you do, damned if you don't. It was unclear what they should have done, so they ended up just falling back naturally and then pitting. And even though it was a massive struggle, I still think it's impressive because Max ended up bringing it home in P5 and he started P11 and the car was in shambles. Checo finished in P8. He did get a penalty because did I talk about penalties? I forgot to talk about the penalties. So Checo got a penalty for causing an incident with Alex Albon, and he got 5 seconds. But because he was in P8, and I guess the person behind him was also in P8, was more than 5 seconds behind, nothing changed. So he stayed in P8. Fernando, during the safety car, went up on the curb entering the pit lane, and you're not supposed to do that. So he got a 5-second penalty, and everyone was very confused because it's a very like rookie mistake that Fernando shouldn't be making. So it was very odd. Okay, so after that, Max fell back after he tried to get up at the front, had the pit change. So everything was kind of out of whack for him, but he still ended up finishing P5. Checo finished P8, which I think is still very impressive. So like when everyone's saying that like, see, this proves that Max is his car, and when his car sucks, he sucks. He didn't suck. He actually did very well and placed the car where it shouldn't have been because it was much, much worse than a P5 finish. And it was on a track that is not conducive to overtaking and all that stuff. So all that considered, I think that Red Bull had a very decent day on track and shouldn't be discounted completely, but also. So at the start, let's focus on the top 5 and their start. So Carlos and Charles were leading the race. There was an interesting radio from George, who gets told on the radio that it looks like they're going to sacrifice Leclerc, which seemed like a dramatic way to say that they were just going to optimize this Charles' position behind Carlos to keep the 2 Ferraris ahead and everyone else behind. But the way they said sacrifice so specific, like it wasn't like he was being a sacrificial lamb for Carlos's win. They were just optimizing his position on track to help both of their positions on track. Another big thing that happened was that Hamilton went way off track in the first lap, and then when he re-entered, he ended up ahead of George and Lando. And George immediately was like, so is he going to give the spot back or not? Mercedes made him give the spot back, but then Lando was on the radio saying, like, I want my spot back. And even when Lando has a point, the way he ends up delivering it is so whiny that it's just like, you don't want to listen to what he's actually saying. But he was right. Lewis should have given the spot back. Lewis and Bono both thought that he was ahead of Lando before that, but basically race control was like, if you just give it back, we're going to let it go and not pursue. Basically up until the first safety car, it was all like this back and forth between like Lando, George, Lewis, sort of on the verge of shifting positions in the first portion of the race. But then the entire grid is very close, because if Carlos was to pit at any point, apparently, in those first 15 laps, he would have ended up in P17. That's how close everyone was. Anyways, when we got to the safety car after Logan's incident, things got a bit more interesting. Both Ferrari and Mercedes stacked their drivers for a pit stop, which worked out for the first drivers in that. So Carlos ended up back in P1, and George ended up back in P3, whereas Charles and Lewis both had to wait to be released in order to not like hit the traffic in the pit lane, which put them into P6 and P7 respectively. Their spots up at the front were taken by Max in P2 and Checo in P4, with Lando in P5. So Charles, as we already talked about, the Red Bulls struggled to keep their position up at the top of the grid, so they naturally fell back, and both Charles and Lewis made their way back up into the top 5. And during this like lull in the middle of the race before the virtual safety car, what was really interesting was to see George kept trying to overtake Carlos, and we all started to realize that Carlos was like on a different strategy, or that he was going at a very specific pace intentionally. And instead of trying to build a gap between him and the rest of the grid, he instead was trying to set the pace for everyone, where he was going fast enough so no one could overtake him, but he was going slow enough that if anyone was going to try to do an undercut on him, or switch to better tires and were somehow faster than him, he was in a position where everyone was so close together that any pit stop would set someone back catastrophically. Watching Carlos during this race is kind of like watching, in an action movie, the montage before a big climactic scene where they're prepping and they have a plan, but you don't necessarily know what the plan is, and as the climactic scene unfolds, you suddenly get hints at what it is they were planning, and you see it come to fruition, and it's all very exciting. Whether it's like a sports game or like a heist or like a battle, whatever. So that's what it felt like watching Carlos like operate today, from like controlling the pace of the entire grid to optimizing Lando's DRS to bring home the win for himself. His big brain energy was going full send today. And I say his because we all know it wasn't Ferrari. We all know this wasn't their strategy. We all know that he took control of the situation. He communicated to them in a very specific way to extract the exact information he needed to execute every step of the plan. He had full control of the race, like in the cockpit, at the pit wall. Everything was under his control, and I'm just telling you guys, it's BB. Big brain energy from Carlos today. The virtual safety car around lap 47 was caused by Esteban's DNF, and it brought like a new strategy into play from Mercedes. They pitted for a fresh set of tires, both of them, which now put them at a huge advantage to the rest of the top 5 because they were on very, very old tires at this point. And it was a brilliant move because after their tires warmed up, George and Lewis had so much more pace than everyone else, it was very obvious. They immediately got past Charles, whose tires were in such a state. I can't even, it's just sad. And so they started closing in on Lando and Carlos. George was desperately trying to get past Lando, and Lewis was getting impatient with how slowly George was going, but Lando was like trying to hold on to P2 for his dear life. And he was within DRS range of Carlos, but he just wasn't fast enough or didn't have the pace to overtake and maintain a lead. So him trying to overtake Carlos would only put him at a disadvantage with the Mercedes. And this is where we got a little bit more of big brain energy from Carlos. I don't know if I was late to the party. I certainly got there faster than Brundle and Crofty, I think. But the first radio message that came in was Carlos asking for an update every lap on the gap between him and Lando. And the commentators were like, does Carlos know who he's actually racing? Because it's not Lando. Why does he need information on Lando? He should be asking for information on the Mercedes. But then, and this is where I got a little suspicious, which actually I just got confused and I'm rebranding it as suspicious now. But Carlos gets told that he is 0.8 seconds behind, that Lando is 0.8 seconds behind him with DRS. And Carlos goes, that's on purpose. And I was like, on purpose what? Like, Lando is on purpose maintaining that specific gap. Carlos is on purpose maintaining that specific, what did that mean? Because like, Carlos letting him maintain that specific gap sounds kind of absurd. But in fact, it was what Carlos was doing. He was letting Lando take advantage of his slipstream so that he can gain DRS and defend against the Mercedes, which put both of them at an advantage and left Mercedes like in the dust. Basically, he knew that Lando trying to beat Carlos would put him at a disadvantage, and that Lando just needed to keep the Mercedes at bay. He knows that if the Mercedes got ahead of Lando, his own race would be in jeopardy, and that it was much better to keep Lando in between him and the Mercedes. It honestly reminded me of the Hobbs and Shaw movie where Jason Statham and The Rock suddenly decide to like work together and like they're not on the same team, but they have to work together against a common enemy. That is like what happened with Carlos and Lando. The part that literally like drives me like blows my mind is that I went back and listened to Lando's radio. If he was ever told what Carlos said, like that was on purpose. Lando was never told. He was just told that it's in his best interest to keep within DRS range of Carlos with nothing else being said, and he never responded to that. So like somehow telepathically he understood what Carlos was trying to do and just like completed the play. Like he just got it. There was no communication between them. It was crazy. So now before I get into the post-race shenanigans, I need to talk about what happened to poor George Russell. He was desperate to win this race, and I don't blame him because for some reason everyone just said that he was going to win this race, not Carlos. I don't know why. Like from the beginning, everyone's like, well, clearly George is going to win this race. And he kept saying he was going to win this race. Like he was determined to win this race, and I guess he got a little desperate. And like towards the end of lap 61, he tried to overtake Lando, missed the mark, and crashed into the wall, and he was just out. And his radio was so sad, like heartbreakingly sad. Like he just kept shouting no, like he's like slamming his fist against the steering wheel. And then afterwards on all his interviews, he looked like he had just been crying. He looked like he had a lump in his throat. Apparently he was walking around the paddock like actually in tears, like he was wearing sunglasses apparently to hide that, and he was like very upset with himself. But like, I'm glad that he's showing vulnerability. They usually pretend like they're fine or they're angry or whatever, but like, that's a really hard thing to do, especially when you like see the finish line and you don't make it, and you've been trying so hard this whole race, and they're all so hot and sweaty and like dehydrated, and this is happening. Like, that's obviously very upsetting. So I don't think he should beat himself up too much. He had a very, very good race up until like the last lap. Poor George. Okay, so before I do the cool down room, I'm going to add the fish to the curry. Okay. Okay. I actually might have oversteamed a bit, so I'm going to do it for a little shorter. Before we got to the cool down room, the radios were so great. Both Charles either. Both Carlos and Lando were so giddy. Lando had his little giggle, like hysterically giggling on the radio. The way he celebrates and the way he whines are both so tweeny. The celebration is obviously a lot more palatable, but he whines and celebrates like he's 14 years old. Lewis was also celebrating, even though technically he only got P3 because George crashed into the wall like a dummy. But he was on George's tail, so there was no telling if George stayed in whether Lewis was going to get past him or not. Also, very cute. After they all got out of the car, Lando and Carlos, still in their helmets and everything, like saw each other, and they both stood there in the very, like, the Paul Rudd meme where he's like, look at us, and they're both like going like this, and then they hug. And they're still giggling when they're taking their helmets off and getting weighed and everything, and Lewis is there too, but he's kind of ignoring both of them, which is kind of odd. I thought he was cool. He's definitely cool with Lando. I thought he was definitely cool with Carlos too, but he just basically ignored both of them. And then the funniest moment to me was when Lando was doing his interview and he's like all full of energy, and he was asked if he was exhausted, and he's like, nah, I'd do it all over again right now. And then it pans to Lewis sitting on the stage, like on the ground, and like he's getting up to do his interview, and he looks like he would not want to do this again for a long, long time. 24 and 38 are very different. In his interview, though, he says, like, congratulations to Lando, congratulations to Carlos, they did so great. Like, he, like, heaps praise on them, but then doesn't talk to them at the stations, and then when they get to the cool down room, he still isn't speaking to them. Like, when they show us the cool down room, Carlos and Lewis and Lando are there first, and they're like chatting away and like discussing the race as they always do. Lando's reactions were so funny. He's like, ooh, ah, ooh, ah. It was lots of noises. And Lewis came in and just started like drinking water and like cleaning his helmet or his face or whatever, and like didn't even like look at them. It was very odd. He might have been just like super tired and just like not interested in having a conversation. And then the podium was great. Lando did not break any trophies this time around. But my favorite part about Ferrari winning a podium is that when they get to the team's national anthem, it's obviously the Italian national anthem, and it's the one time when you see the benefit of Ferrari exclusively hiring Italian people, because the entire team, all the mechanics, all the engineers, everyone is singing the anthem so loudly because they're all Italian, and it's great. It was amazing. Very happy for Carlos. So the driver of the day was officially Carlos. Can't really argue with that. He did an incredible job. He also deserves engineer of the day, strategist of the day, mechanic of the day, every position on the Ferrari. He is Ferrari. He's inevitable. He is Ferrari. I'd also like to give a shout out to Liam Lawson, who got points in his first F1 race, which is an incredible feat. Also, Lando had a great race today and telepathically communicated with Carlos, which is not easy to do. Also, not that important, but I do want to shout out Max bringing the car home in P5 when it was relatively undrivable, so good for him. And the dig in the box, it's kind of half-hearted. I'm not that committed to this dig. But I think I'll go with Max impeding during quality and then the FIA not punishing him for it, even though it was kind of deserved. And also the AlphaTauri rep just not showing up. Like, very obvious collusion happening there. I also want to say that I think that Charles, I don't really want to mention him in this category, but I do think I need to mention Charles because, like, as much as today was well-earned and well-deserved by Carlos, one of the reasons he got it, besides just driving very, very well, is that he took matters into his own hands. Like, he stopped listening to Ferrari. He took control of the situation. He asked them for the information he specifically needed. Charles doesn't do that. Charles just listens to Ferrari, and it screws him over time and time again. And he just really needs to stand up, grow a backbone, fight back, do something, because this is sad to watch. All right, so today's race results are Carlos, Lando, Lewis, Charles, Max, Gasly, Oscar, Checo, Liam Lawson, Kevin, Alex, Joe, Nico, Logan, and Alonso. And then the DNFs were George, Valtteri, Ocon, Yuki, and Lance didn't race. The current standings are Max with 374 points, Checo with 223, somehow Lewis with 180 points, Fernando with 170 points, Carlos with 142, Charles with 123, George with 109, and Lando with 97. And in the constructors, Red Bull continues to lead with 597, and now Mercedes is number 2 with 289, followed by Ferrari with 265, Aston Martin with 217, McLaren with 139, Alpine with 81, Williams with 21, Haas with 12, Alfa Romeo with 10, and AlphaTauri with 5, now thanks to Liam Lawson. So that is it for the Singapore Grand Prix. It's not completely ready. I will show it when it is, but I'll just give you a quick preview of the journey. I'll post a picture. Ta-da! Don't know if you can see it. I'll post a proper picture on social media. But next up is we're heading to Suzuki for the Japanese Grand Prix, which means extra Yuki content. Can't wait to see what he recommends this year. Last year was a toilet. Who knows what he'll recommend this year. Make sure you subscribe, share with any potential boxes, review, and you can always DM me with your thoughts and questions because I love to hear from you guys. And in the meantime, make sure you follow at BoxBoxF1Pod to see the final food results and to keep up in between races. Other than that, see you soon. Box.